Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar on Enabling Custom Sales Training. Today we have a very action-packed up webinar with some good content speakers on it. And for those of you who joined us online, through the GoToWebinar access, on your panel on the right-hand side, you'll be able to ask questions. There's a chat area where you can chat with any of our staff here if you have any technical issues, or if you have any questions for us specifically. We'll absolutely share that with the whole organization or with everybody on the webinar if it's appropriate, or we'll answer your question individually if it pertains more specifically to you. So with that, we also will be recording this webinar and having it available afterward. If you have peers or others who would like to view it or take a listen to it, we'll be happy to make that available. So with that, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Scott Herber. I am the Vice President at VIA Learning, and I'm fortunate enough today to have two talented speakers join us. We have Mr. Charles Alvarez from Waste Management, who is the Director of Learning and Development. Charles has over 17 years of experience in sales management, and he's been working with Fortune 200 companies, and he is currently deploying some really interesting blended solutions for his sales organization. So welcome on board, Charles.
I appreciate it.
Thank you. And also joining me here is Julie Brink. Julie is our Director of e-learning. Julie has 15 years of learning experience in both curriculum design, development, and delivery for everything in the blended world, from mobile to social and all the way to web-based, instructor-led, and virtual instructor-led training. Welcome, Julie.
Thank you very much.
All right, so into the agenda for today. So here's what we're going to try to go through in a pretty interactive way. We try to keep it relatively informal, and I do encourage anybody on the webinar to ask questions through the chat box. We try to do it not on the phone because we can get too many people speaking at the same time. But if you have any questions, feel free to type them in, and we will get right back to you, and we will definitely share those that work for the whole group. So in our agenda, we're going to talk about trends in blended learning. We're going to talk about implementing a program approach, and we're going to try to incorporate some real customer examples. And if there's any questions that come up, we'll highlight anything else that we can. And we'll also talk about tips to make your blended program more cohesive and decision-making factors. At the end, we will also have time for questions and answers, but again, I highly encourage everyone to ask any questions during the program so we can keep things moving. Before we do that, though, I'm going to actually start this whole thing with a quick poll to get some interaction with the audience. And our first poll today is, and you should see on your screen, a question that's about to come up, and it says, what is the current mode that you use for sales training? And if you could tell me, what you see, you should have a number of questions on the screen. It should say that we use instructor-led training. We use a combination of self-directed, web-based training, on-the-job training. And if you could answer those questions, that will help us. We've got a whole lot of people on this webinar today, so the quicker you can answer, the faster we'll be able to get to it. The reason that we ask these questions are to try to get some perspective for our speakers to understand where the audience currently sits in terms of what's done. And a number of you have already answered, but I'll give it about another 10 seconds to see if we can get most of you to go. I have to admit, this is one of the fastest voting groups we've ever had. We've got probably 80% of you have already voted, so I'll give it a quick second, and then we'll go in. And to no surprise, the largest majority of voters right now are in the instructor-led. So I'm going to actually share this with everybody, and here are the results. So if you look on it, you'll see that Charles, Julie, and myself will be looking to 62% of all the learning is done by instructor-led. The second runner-up is web-based training, and then we have a tie for self-directed or on-the-job. So not too far out of the norm for what we've seen, with probably an increase in web-based training specifically over the last few years, and maybe a little bit more self-directed, but probably depends on the audience.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, I'll have Julie and Charles kind of think about that as we move through this and see if we can address anybody who has questions on that. So what's new? Let's talk about the trends in blended learning and specifically for sales enablement. We can certainly add in any other vertical or job requirements, but we're going to focus mostly on the sales side of it today. So with that, what is blended learning?
Well, blended learning in a nutshell is using a variety of different delivery methods for your training. So some of you may use blended learning in the training programs you have now, a lot of instructor-led training and web-based training, self-directed and on-the-job, all those can be combined together into a blended learning program. Traditionally, it's been instructor-led training and web-based training, but with current technologies, it's really enabled new ways of thinking and training. So it can include, simulations, digital libraries, content repositories for those who like to read, ebooks, podcasts, virtual instructor-led training, which we'll talk about a little bit more as well, other wireless and mobile technologies, webcasting videos. YouTube is a very popular training space, oddly enough. And then wikis to share information, blogs, diaries, gaming is rapidly growing as well. So Blended is taking any of those components and utilizing all those into one program package.
So Blended could be any combination of, and unless you went crazy and tried to put everything into one.
Yeah, that's probably not going to
happen.
But yes.
But any combination, is how we're defining for today. That's blended. Excellent.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Well, talk about why.
Well, you use blended learning because it, for a variety of different reasons. It gives the learners access to people and information they may not otherwise get. If you have a global audience, for example, or a remote workforce, they might only get information from one hub, and so blending it allows them to get information quicker from resources other than their local environment.
Okay.
Another reason to use blended learning is it generally speaks to all learning styles. So the different methods within each of the blended learning components help learners develop their problem-solving and critical thinking skills. It sends out information to them in a new way, so they might get the same information in a wiki as they would in a web-based training course, but it's speaking to different learning styles. So the learner then has to think about and compute this information that they're getting into their brain.
So it does a couple things for you. So it gives you different ways to get people to get access to it, but it also takes advantage of different learning aptitudes.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can kind of hit on multiple areas there.
Yeah. And this then subtly forces learners to take responsibility for their own learning. Another benefit, which we'll talk more about later, of a blended program is learning retention. The more a learner repeats information, the more likely it is that they will recall it, and then more specifically recall it when they need it.
Okay, so it's a way to repeat the message.
Yes.
Well, what's the current trend that you see the highest attention being paid to?
Well, the market is seeing that companies want to reduce costs, increase reach and volume of their training programs, and then also keep pace with rapid changes to training curriculum and technology. So they want to do all of that. So a blended format is a great way to take advantage of those needs and those wants. As budgets begin to grow, more attention is going to be given to training, whether training should be in person or whether it should be remote, and when then it should be blended.
Got it.
So then you have to decide how best to use the technology. And these items here on the screen, the social media, informal learning, social learning, virtual instructor-led training, mobile learning, those are all up and coming, very well used now, but the growth is expected to be great in those areas because of the technologies that we have available to us now.
Got it. Yeah, and coming from the tech sector, when I was with one of the big three-letter companies, the technology innovations were coming at a more rapid pace, so you would have to increase your training for your channels at a more rapid pace than sometimes you could keep up with in an instructor-led model. So coming up with a blended solution is still there.
Information out. It'll help bridge the talent gap as well, because if you take advantage of these technologies, more training will get done and empower the training development departments to get their information out.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, let's talk about it. Charles, let's bring you into the discussion here on the waste management perspective then. Maybe you can just drive this one and tell us more about what's happening with waste management.
It was an interesting statistic in that first poll that 62% of the population was focused primarily on ILT as their primary mode of delivery. And as you mentioned, that trend has slowly been shifting over the last couple of years towards web-based, a lot of it driven by the business environment. And even today, as Julie was mentioning, there's continued pressure around organizations to expand their reach and do more with fewer resources. The neat thing is, with all of these technologies that we just kind of reviewed very quickly, these advances in technology and some of the learning theory that's out there has given us all kinds of new avenues that we can use to deliver training to our target audiences if you're willing to kind of go down that path and explore them. More and more what I'm seeing is that work or learning is being embedded in the workplace rather than bringing a learner out of the workspace into a classroom. And that just kind of lines up with the fact that we're still trying to get more done with fewer resources. We want to minimize that out of the work time. But it raises an interesting question about how do we reach a learner in their work and environment and provide them content in a way that they can consume it without disrupting their workflow. So if I can, I begin with a real basic premise that the only reason a corporation, Waste Management included, that provides training to their employees is because we're wanting them to do something different or better or faster. And really the driving force behind that is because it's the belief that if they do those things different, better, or faster, we're going to get a business result. So the question to answer now is, with all of these technologies and blended learning, how does that afford us an opportunity to enhance our traditional learning experience to really drive that behavior change? There's a,
the piece that comes to mind, Charles, and I know we didn't even, you and I haven't spoken about this, but what pressure does that put on the learning organization to understand the worker's environment and what they did? Because historically, we used to just bring people to us.
Yep.
So does that make it more challenging for you?
Oh, it absolutely does. In basic needs analysis work, most of the audience will relate to the fact that there's this audience analysis that we go through. And in some cases, I've seen a lot of learning practitioners can kind of skip over that because we know we're bringing them in here. We know what that controlled environment is. But today, as we explore mobile technologies, we explore web-based or virtual, there's more and more a question around where will they be consuming that content? What distractions do I have to deal with? And with technology variability, what kinds of operating systems and platforms do I need to consider?
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. I think one of the pieces I sincerely respect about your approach too is thinking about the learning objective and thinking of that environment at the same time, and that takes a shift in the paradigm for a lot of training organizations. It's not easy to overcome.
But it's a benefit at the same time, Scott, because we're not boxed into this corner where we have to say I have to figure out how to make this work through an instructor-led or through a web-based. We've got this suite of delivery modes to choose from, and we can really let our business objectives drive that delivery mode.
That's fantastic. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you think about mobile as an example, and I know we're going to talk through a couple of these in particular, but just the quick stats around mobile and what's happening there. Things like the fact that people more and more today are using their smartphones to take phone calls. I mean, upwards of 30% of all calls now are done through a smartphone. We're seeing significant growth in data traffic across the Middle East and Africa, with growth rates at 129% at the moment. And an interesting fact to me, and anybody who's got kids can relate to this, but in 3.5 short years, there will be nearly one mobile device for every person out there. And you think about the impact that gives you in your reach. U.S. market alone.
Yeah, I think that's amazing. I mean, I think that the proliferation is fantastic, and I didn't mean to step over. So that last point, go ahead, Charles.
I was just going to say the U.S. market alone for mobile products, you're seeing more and more of that growth, but we saw a first number in 2009 around 632 million, and it's expected to grow to over 14 billion. That's a pretty significant growth rate in 5 short years.
It is amazing growth. I think I remember we, in a previous discussion on the mobile side, we had talked about there's more mobile phones than there are cars and televisions combined. So you can add up all the cars, televisions, and PCs, combine them, and you still don't have as many as you do smartphones and phones in the world. So it's an interesting new path, which has some pros and cons with it as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the interesting thing, if you think about the mobile side of it, which has some interesting business benefits in getting reach and frequency, it has some limitations on the footprint side. But there's also an interesting new trend or new tool set you can use by going peer-to-peer. Can you talk a little bit about that and what you guys are doing at Waste Management too, Charles?
Yeah, absolutely. As we looked at peer-to-peer and viral learning, we're seeing it take on a greater role, particularly in our focus of training, which is, again, back to that adoption or the behavior change. If YouTube and Facebook taught us anything, it's simply that if you put a platform out there where people can share publicly, they will gladly put their intellectual property out there, their best practices for others to learn from. So it's more a matter of enabling a format that you can get these folks talking to one another. So as an example, what's on the screen is our onboarding program community portal that we created to support new sales reps coming into the organization and really open up new avenues to tie them together so that they can communicate and share knowledge in new and creative ways. This particular portal opens up direct lines of contact from a new sales rep to our various business units so that if they run into a challenge, they've got an easy communication channel right to the business as opposed, if their manager was tied up on a call or was on vacation. And it also opens up that ability for them to share with one another hey, we all learned this little piece. I'm trying it out. What are those best practices and experiences? And it's been a lot of fun watching this communication and this peer-to-peer learning take place, and it's taking on a greater and greater role in our delivery model.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting mental shift as well, that some people fear losing control of some of the content. And I know, coming from the sales environment myself in large Fortune 100 companies, that discussion point is always happening. So having it in an environment you can share it and at least understand it, I think it's a huge business benefit.
Yeah, and I think companies more and more are learning either to get comfortable with the security questions they have and how to control it, or they're identifying ways to do it. But I've seen other organizations deploy similar types of social media solutions with some different tools, but the end game is still the same. This mode of delivery is becoming more and more important in the learning solution, and your employees that are coming into the organization young today, if you don't provide it, they're doing it anyway via their own mobile devices.
Right. No, absolutely. So you can either be in the conversation or try to figure out what they're doing on your own, which is always a tough task for anyone. So I agree with you. I don't think it's so much an if you do it, it's how you do it. I think it really matters.
Yep, I agree.
And this peer-to-peer learning falls into the informal learning camp, and they say that roughly 70% of learning is done informally. So it is extremely important that companies pay attention to this and leverage it.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, and I think it's interesting stuff. Go ahead, Charles.
I was going to say, to Julie's point, it lines right up with that concept of embedding learning in the work, or that concept of real-time learning, where you've got a peer who's in a work situation that's hit a roadblock, and they've got an instant avenue to find whatever nugget they need in order to continue their work.
Right. Good.
Great.
Well, let's take so we've hit high level of, okay, mobile's coming and it's not going away and it's going to get bigger. Peer-to-peer is obviously an important piece, especially with 70% of learning being informal. There's also traditional or web-based training. Can you talk to me about that, Julie?
Yeah. So traditionally, like I mentioned before, blended learning has been a combination of instructor-led training and web-based training, and now blended learning is encompassing so much more. But web-based training is still a core component of many blended programs because it has a wide reach. It can be taken at any time. It's asynchronous. A whole lot of benefits that go along with web-based training. Sales enablement training uses web-based training programs or courses in order to take advantage of active learning, so you can have scenarios or interactivity in your courseware, and this helps reinforce the learning point.
Right. And
then also short chunks of information, so small tidbits of information can be developed or deployed over web-based training that really dial in on a specific goal or outcome that you want to get across to your team.
Right.
So some of the benefits of the web-based training programs are, like I mentioned, remote. You can have also consistent and rapid deployment of content. So you don't have to make multiple versions of one course. You have one course, you do version control at your headquarters location, for example, and that content is the same regardless of the audience who sees it. It's asynchronous, so the remote sales forces can take it at any point in time. And then you also have global access to subject matter experts that can help develop your web-based training program for your global audience.
Yeah, I think one of the characteristics I've seen there is really interesting, especially regardless of whether you're a technology company or somebody has a new topic. If you have a subject matter expert and then you try to proliferate that either quickly or effectively, using web-based training is a great tool because you can capture that subject matter's expertise and then have it replicated when it's business convenient for those learners, which is really incredibly valuable.
It is.
So that's your. Yeah. But contrary to what we're thinking, instructor-led training, I heard somebody say that it's dead.
It's not.
Dead,
as
Julie?
most of our attendees will attest to.
Right.
We saw on the poll that it is not dead. It's very much alive. It's making a bit of a resurgence, even if you will. It's also coming out in a new form, which is virtual instructor-led training, so I'll get to that in a minute. When you might want to use ILT is role-playing scenarios or situations with your sales team. When any subject matter might require immediate and in-depth answers to questions, you have a very, you're training on a certain product that is very technologically advanced,
right.
So you might need to have an instructor-led training session so that the subject matter expert can answer very pointed questions about that particular product. And also when the content would just benefit from in-person collaboration and conversation. There is something to be said for face-to-face eye contact and conversations and those nuances that you get when you're in person.
Well, and I think too, I know that, and Charles, feel free to jump in here as well. When you're face-to-face, when you've got a physical environment, or when you have something that really requires that true 3D, real physical activity, an instructor-led course is the way to go.
Yeah, absolutely. There are definitely situations where ILT is the right choice. The neat thing is today we get to make a choice.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. It's not like the old days when we had to either do it or don't, right? In instructor-led courses. Yeah, I agree.
There is a new ILT thought, though, which is virtual. So you can collaborate with your either nationwide or global peers through virtual meetings. This allows you to have the strengths of an instructor-led training program, but also with more convenience and cost savings of e-learning, because you don't have to pay for travel expenses and a lot of time out of work for the participants. In virtual ILTs, typically the audience size is smaller, generally 20 or fewer participants, so you can still break up people and have conversations. If you have webcams for everyone, you can still see people face-to-face and read their facial expressions when you're doing role plays or scenarios. So virtual ILT really is a good idea, maybe perhaps if you have some budget constraints or something like that.
Sure, depending on the content,
Yep.
budget, the timeline, the access points, absolutely, a lot of good points in that one as well.
Yep.
Okay. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about implementing it from a program or a programmatic approach. How do we look at the big picture and tie it all together? So if you think of it from a blended picture, from a blended strategy for sales enablement, I think, Julie, you had a couple comments earlier on, and so did you, Charles, on using different tools for different objectives, understanding where we're going, but also having different learning styles and different learning capabilities by your organization gives you a chance with a blended one to kind of hit, 3 or 4 different key points in that. But maybe you could start on, just the blended learning and sales training, fundamental here, Julie.
Sure. Well, blended learning can be a cost-effective and efficient way to support your sales staff. You can take any of these different types of learning delivery methods and blend them together into a cohesive program. So you can take a web-based training course and combine it with a mobile course, and then also include some just-in-time training and come up with a great sales training program. You do need to do your needs analysis and cost-benefit analysis as well to determine that these components are the right ones for you and your organization. But any of these different components can be used in a successful blended learning program for your sales team.
Right. Yeah.
Really get the message across in a variety of ways.
Yeah, I think you've got it. Yeah, there's the number in there. Charles, did you have something to add to that?
I was going to say, and it's worth noting, and I think we're going to kind of get into this a little bit, but this concept of the programmatic approach is really forcing learning communities to think through a change in their training approach. So it's not so much I'm going to teach a class to keep it sales relative. I'm not going to teach a class on handling objections and need to think of a delivery mode, but it's a much broader program that incorporates all of these different components to deliver certain enabling objectives to achieve that behavior that you're looking for. So it's really a much broader view of learning and development as opposed to a unique or specific learning event.
Agreed, totally. Yeah, I think that's a great answer too. Well,
yeah.
So I think here's an interesting example you have, Julie, that kind of combines, at least visually, some a program approach to a big picture.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So this right here is an example of a programmatic approach we took with Hewlett-Packard. The ultimate goal was to train their team, of course, their new employees over about a 3-month period, but also they wanted to build a community of their global team. So what we did is we did our needs analysis and we came up with 3 different sections of the journey. So there's some pre-work, there's some actual work, and then there's some post-work. And that blended program combined all sorts of different components: mobile learning, podcasts, web-based training, self-directed learning, 4 virtual instructor-led training sessions, follow-up workshop, both web and mobile assessments, and then some discussion forums. So it took a lot of different components. This is a very robust program approach, and wove them all together in order to make one cohesive program and really build a community with the employees.
Yeah, I think the piece that's impressive in this is not just the utilization of almost all the tools you possibly could deliver in the different modalities, but the uniqueness way of of you tying them all together, in making it more of an interesting concept, so you have
Yes.
linkage between the two.
Yes.
So if you took a mobile component and then you went to the virtual instructor, it ties
They
together.
all talk together a little bit.
Right.
Yeah. One thing I do want to say, though, too, is that there are other very successful programs you can put together that don't put all of these different pieces. This is very robust. This might be overkill for some organizations. You can still have a very successful blended learning program with just, an e-learning course bookended with a mobile learning and maybe a game, or an e-learning course with one virtual instructor-led training session, and then some social media follow-up. There are some other programmatic approaches, of course. It really depends on the organization.
Yeah, and I think you hit on one that's really interesting for me anyway. On the gaming side of it, sometimes when you say game, people go to a gamer's mentality of virtual avatars, complicated Wii, Xbox kind of depth, and you don't always need to do that.
You don't.
Right?
Very simple games. We did some informal research here, and the things people want to get out of playing a game are that they're fun and that they're intellectually challenging.
Right.
They don't necessarily care about the whiz-bang graphics and movement and sound. They just want to have a good time and laugh and smile and then get something out of it.
Right. And I think
something new.
And I think you have to be very, very in tune with who your market is, who the learning audience is, because
Absolutely.
you don't want to be accused of having what was your dancing clown, right?
Yes.
You don't want they don't want you to think that you've taken the learning organization too far and you're doing something that doesn't fit within your organization. But I think we're seeing more and more demand from our clients and how to use games in such a way just to get people's attention. Because one of the people in the question said, how do you encourage some of these things to happen? And I think some of that has to be cultural, some of that has to be visible reward, some of it has to be some way within your organization to say, hey, we want you to do this. In the learning space, we can track and record and measure, but you also have some that you want optional and you want to create an environment that entices them to go after it.
Yes, most definitely.
Anything to add to that one, Charles?
I was going to say gaming is a neat topic and one near and dear to my heart as a sales guy. But there's a lot of creative things out there right now on how to actually use them. And as much as I like to play them, I'll agree with Julie. We don't deploy them unless there's a learning purpose around it. But as an example, and I'll touch on this, I think, on the next slide, but we've been able to take games in a simple format like a Jeopardy board and build them so that they're SCORM compliant and hosted on our LMS. But then we present them to the participants as a, log in, try and play this game. It'll give you a little preview or sneak peek of the content that's up there, just kind of as a warm-up. But because it's SCORM compliant on my LMS, I can roll up all the responses and answers and use that to establish my knowledge baseline to help facilitate my assessment process downstream. And from the learner's perspective, they just logged on and played a game and had some fun.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, yeah, you both get a business benefit from that, right? They get something, they get a little awareness and some fundamentals taken care of, and you, or the instructor or the course, the program gets the benefit of knowing what individuals are doing. So I think that's a great way to do it, because you can do the transparency way of please answer this questions, but it's a lot more engaging and probably more realistic if you do it in a game format. So I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, it's a lot less threatening to new employees also.
Yep.
Well, Charles, so I've put up the, I see in front of me the waste management strategy. Can you, talk about some of these strategies and how they link together?
Sure. So this is a much broader piece. It's not necessarily program specific, but kind of highlights how we think about learning at Waste Management. And again, it's that concept of the end state being a change in behavior that's going to drive those business results. So if we start there, then it ceases to be that single learning event. It becomes this program that we've broken up into 5 phases. The first one centering around the organizational readiness and that marketing and communication component. Then there's the pre-work or the pre-learning component prior to attending whatever those structured workshops are. And then probably the most important phase, that adoption and behavior change. How do we reinforce the content? Learning intervention is essentially the catalyst for change or the enabler of change. But people aren't necessarily going to immediately go back onto the workspace and start doing things differently. They need that reinforcement and support. And you'll see the peer-to-peer support is a key role in this particular drive for the behavior change. And then we wrap ours up with the business impact. The boxes underneath just kind of illustrate how we've begun to think about all of these different delivery modes in this blended approach and how we can deploy them. So from the early stages of the marketing communication through viral marketing, web-based pieces or mobile pieces that go out. We've seen some success with short Think of it like movie theater type trailers that get pushed out that are just 15-second teasers to kind of prepare the organization for change. But again, hitting different learning styles, delivering it in different types of formats so that we get a much better retention rate. But as you walk across those columns, I don't want to read them to everyone that's on the phone with us today, but you'll see all those different delivery styles from ILT to VILT to web-based that we can bring to bear at each phase, and really opens up the opportunity for us to say, in order to accomplish this objective, what's the correct delivery mode that we want to use?
Right. I think one of the things, I mentioned earlier, and I sincerely appreciate it, because coming from the learning world myself, when you think about, if you think with the end in mind and work your way backwards, kind of like you mentioned earlier, you have a ton of different options on how to get to that learning objective, but you have to always, foundation yourself with that and kind of anchor yourself there.
Yep, absolutely.
So, well, I think that, if I could, Charles, that's a brilliant slide. And for those of you who are raising your hands and asking questions, yes, this will be made available afterwards, so you can take a look and kind of see some of these things if you want to for your organization. But I think this gives a very in-depth overlook of how your process works and the tools available to get there, which is a great share. So thanks for that, Charles.
Absolutely.
So let's talk about the tips to make your blending program stick. What do we do? We've got a lot of content here. What do you say to that?
Well, really what you need to do is start by knowing your objectives and what your end goals are, as you would with any type of learning program. Pretty straightforward, I think.
Yep.
And then also making sure that there's a consistent look and feel, tone, verbiage, or even a theme integrated throughout your program is very important. As on the Hewlett-Packard example that I showed, all of those deliverables in that program have a similar look and feel, and the tone and the voice that they use, so that there is consistency. Also using some teasers, communication, pre-learning communication, sometimes developed through, or deployed, through mobile, or maybe other email methods or something like that.
Or a game, as Charles mentioned, yeah.
Yep. And then referencing the other courses within the program. So don't be afraid to say, in the next course you take, or in the third session from now, you're going to learn A, B, and C. Don't be afraid to say that, because it really helps tie everything together and makes the experience cohesive. And the learners will remember that. Oh, yeah, I was told I was going to learn about this.
Right.
So.
Well, I think one of the things, and I'm going to actually launch another quick poll for the audience to see if we can get the audience view on this. If you could, everyone who's out there, you should have an ability to look and say, what are your biggest challenges you have in putting together a blended program? Is it a budgetary constraint, technology, subject matter expertise, or access to them? Is it time? And I think, Charles, you and I spoke a little bit the other day about it. Some of the issues that I would have considered historically would be even some of the team. Do I have a team inside the learning organization? Because there are some really good instructor-led training curriculum designers who may think that that is the only path to go. So that's, I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Actually, you bring up a good point. Traditional instructor-led training is a staple for so long, has kind of bred some experts at delivering or creating that kind of mode. And even we have training specialists that are very effective at delivering ILT. I guess if there was another challenge that's out there that's perhaps not up on the screen, is one around transitions from an instructor-led to a web-based to a virtual instructor-led. They're very different in the way that you create them. They're different in the way that the design and ISD work is done, and at the end of the day, it's a different delivery mode. So
right.
it's worthwhile to keep a focus on those differences, and don't just assume because I've got a great instructor-led, I can just flip it onto a web-based training, it's going to work just as well.
Right. No, I think
Excellent point.
Yeah, I think that we've heard that many times. Okay, you're not just going to. We just need you to convert the instructor-led to web-based. Go. Thank you. Right, and it's not as simple.
Or convert the web-based to mobile.
Right.
It doesn't work.
So let me close this poll out. I've got a couple of questions that I'll integrate over the next few minutes here. But interestingly enough, the two biggest issues are probably no surprise. It is budget and time are the top two issues, right? Time being the largest issue in that, they don't have time for whatever reason. The secondary being budget. And then a third piece is the technology. I don't have the technologies for some of the pieces of blended to make it available for them. So I don't think any of that is too surprising. I think time is obviously an issue, especially as you first begin to look at it. Charles, do you have any comments on time versus budget versus technology?
Yeah, actually, there's a couple of stuff that jump to mind. Budget is one that I hear with some frequency. I'm glad to see that it's shifting, that that's not the #1 constraint that we have today. But if I can start with the budget, one of the first things that comes to mind is when you shift from that approach of here's a single course or event and look at it more programmatically, where you have all of these other components, you begin to gain some efficiencies of scale and the ability to ask the question that says, to deliver this particular learning objective, perhaps it doesn't have to be the high-cost ILT. I can reserve some of my cost or budget and deliver this electronically or asynchronously, and then redeploy those savings from that to another component of the program. So you get some more flexibility to balance the budget constraints. The time piece in particular, while I would say that was definitely a big one, it is changing. There are a lot of different rapid development tools that are coming online. I'm seeing a lot of different producers take what used to be long time offering tools and expertise and translating those into very easy to use applications that a layperson can sit down and very quickly drop in polling questions and things like that. So I'm seeing the time become less and less of a pressure, but there is some time you'd have to invest up front to research where are those technologies and how do I get my hands on them.
For sure. Yeah, I think those are really good points, and I agree with you. You know, now that time is the issue, getting a history and getting used to all of the different tools is probably the bigger concern, and making sure you know which ones are applicable. Because if it's the first time you've done it, it's going to be a lot harder. The more you do it, the shorter the time it takes to do it and get approval for it as well.
Yep, absolutely. And there are people that have gone down these roads in the past, so if it's something that you're new to or you're just now exploring, I'd encourage you to reach out and find someone who's gone down that and solicit some feedback on what types of tools and technology have they found that solve both the budget and the time challenge.
Well, let's switch to, we've talked at a high level about some of these components. Let's talk about some of the decision-making factors, because this segues nicely based on that polling question. I think the first one, we've talked about, which is, defining your learning objectives. And Charles, I'm going to throw this one over to you.
Yeah, Scott, I've got some very strong opinions about this one. I've watched a common mistake a lot of organizations make, where they'll get a request from their business unit that essentially says, I want a 2-hour e-learning class, or I want an instructor-led workshop that covers blank, and they go down that road. With the advent of all of these different delivery modes, we are really now in a nice position where we can put the delivery mode decision on the table and ask the question first and foremost, what's the business driver I'm trying to achieve? What are those behaviors that are going to yield that business result? And then define those learning objectives. And once the learning objectives are defined, then you can determine what's the best mode of delivery to get that to your target audience. So it now becomes a very deliberate decision. So as an example, if we have a new product launch where I'm launching a widget and I need the sales organization to understand what it is and how it works, if I can assess it very quickly through like a multiple choice, did they get it, that's very conducive to a web-based learning format. I can build that asynchronously and reach multiple geographies and time zones. If, however, my learning objective is a much more advanced sales skill where they've got to stand up and demonstrate proficiency with a behavior, so I need to be able to watch them, for example, deliver a value proposition effectively through a role play or a simulation, then I may need to shift that into an instructor-led format where I can get that initial feedback. But the objectives drive that decision.
Right. No, I think those are great bookend ways to look at it too. Am I really looking for just an information check or a knowledge check, or am I looking for some physical, in that case physical, but also just being able to articulate something more complicated and with multiple variables in the equation. That's more conducive to other environments. So interesting way to look at it. But I like the process though, Charles, of thinking what's the end goal and then having a business discussion around it.
Well, and if you took one more step to that process, once you had your learning objectives, and said, I'm going to teach them to do blank, and then ask the question, how do I test for that? How do I assess whether or not they've got it? Your assessment process itself will lend you some insight as to what's the correct delivery mode. A multiple choice test, again, you can kind of go back to the e-learning type formats. But if you can get a good picture around, I want them to do this, and here's how I'll know, it'll give you some direction as to what would be the appropriate delivery.
Great answer. Yep. How do I measure that? How will I know when they've done it? Is a great way to define that.
Yep.
Okay. Well, let's switch and let's talk more about the learner's retention?
Well, you'll know if they've gotten it, if they've retained the information. So a way to help them retain the information is, we talked about this very, very briefly early on, but repeat the information many, many times in many different ways. Blended formats allow you to repeat the message that you're getting across multiple times in multiple mediums. You know, your brain can really only hold about 7 pieces of information or in your memory for about 30 seconds. If you don't repeat it, then it disappears. So blended allows you to employ multiple instructional methods in order to retain that information because you hear it time and time again.
Right.
This then leads us to the recommendation of using chunks and bits of training. So providing information in small chunks helps them remember that. If someone's overwhelmed with too much information, you know, 10 learning objectives, for example, well, the message gets lost and they're not going to remember that information. So really use no more than 3 to 5 learning objectives per training piece.
Yep.
Also using interactivity or active learning enables learners to see their progress and their success as they're going along. They can fail and go back and redo something if they want to. That works for some people. They can say, okay, great, I got this sales scenario response correct, whatnot, that's perfect. Also to help learners retain the information is to set clear goals. Really tell them, okay, this is what you're going to learn, and make it relevant. Make sure that they know this is relatable to me and my daily activity and what my goals are for the day or the week or the month.
Good. Yeah, I think so. I think especially the interactivity piece is huge in the sales world because, you know, you're bombarded and, you know, by default they may have a short attention span. So just that corrective, quick action is the right way to take it.
Yep.
And, you know, Julie, if I might add one little piece to it, you hit this chunks and bits.
Mm-hmm.
In the sales organization, we find that so valuable, right? I mean, the Adult Learning Theory 101, where people attach what they're learning now to something they already know. The ability to create this in a program format with the different delivery modes also gives us the chance to think about what are they doing between those particular content delivery pieces, where we can deliver a small learning objective and enable them to perform a skill and then give them time to actually roll around in the work and try it and experiment with it, and then add to that learning experience in the next phase.
Most definitely. Thank you for that, Charles.
Yeah, especially if you know, in the old school of front-loading everything and give them everything they need to know on the 12-step process and then say, okay, go out and do it. And then by the time they get out there, all they remember is the 12 steps and they couldn't remember the first 11 on how to get there because it's the last thing they learned. So I think
that's why we have acronyms.
Well, aside from acronyms, we also have interactivity now, Charles, so we can kind of balance both. So let's talk about some of the development considerations.
Well, when you're deciding what, oh, I'm sorry, Scott, I cut you off.
No, that's right. I was just saying, going back to what people were saying, you know, time and budget at the top, and then right here, you know, there's always the budgetary.
Absolutely, you need to determine, you know, what your budget is or what you need, and then get the relevant budget.
Yep.
Perhaps. Also, you know, what resources you have available to you. You're doing audience analysis. Who's your audience? How big is your audience? What are your learning goals and expected outcomes? How complex is the information you're trying to teach?
Yep.
That will definitely tell you what type of training modality to use and your deployment method, what timeline you have. If you only have 4 weeks to come up with something, you know, you're not going to do a full, robust, web-based training plus all these other pieces. You might just do something quick to the point.
Right, and I think that goes nicely back to what Charles was saying about, you know, thinking of the learning objective and how do I measure it? How will I know when they accomplish it?
Right.
When they accomplish it, I think if you flip back to where we were on that HP, where you had an assimilation plan, where you've got 10 stakeholders and each one of them has their objectives they give you and say, here's the metrics, here's how I'll know. You've got a fairly complex role in combining all those together.
You've got to do a full analysis and determine the real outcomes.
Right, right.
And then also reporting. What type of reporting do you need? What's the expectation around it? Who gets it? That type of thing.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, I think Charles and you both talked about that as well, as being able to make something SCORM compliant and still track it even if it's in game. It's a great way to report on different pieces for you.
Yep. As long as the reporting is relevant.
And then, Charles, switch over to the deployment methods. So you've got some different options here. What are they?
Yeah, as you think through, another point to keep in mind as you're deciding on the delivery mode for a piece of a program, one of them is where are the teams located, right? Not only your own delivery channel, but where the audience is. That'll have a big impact on the method that you choose to deliver the content. One of the pieces, and this is a lessons learned, and I'm not the tech guy, so for those of you that are like me that maybe don't have the master and IT. When you go mobile or you're starting to look at some of those devices, one of the things you're going to want to really think about is how will your end users be consuming that content? Are they on an Apple platform? Are they on a Windows platform? And in mobile in particular, we all have different mobile devices that are out there, and some of those have different operating systems. So when you build a mobile piece of content that you're going to deliver, you're going to want to make sure that you're building it in a format that comes across to your end users. So keep that in mind as you're doing your audience analysis, the question around how are they going to view it so that you can build it to reach the largest audience. Mm-hmm. One other piece that plays a big role in my consideration around how we're going to deliver it comes from our audience and where are they. And more as companies go global, we've got to solve for not only local time zones or 2 or 3 hour changes here within the U.S., but perhaps 12-hour changes across oceans. So if you do have to reach broader audiences in multiple time zones, maybe a good discussion around an asynchronous solution on an e-learning format as opposed to waking up at 2 a.m. to deliver it live.
Right.
Absolutely.
Really good points. And I think, to highlight what you said earlier, we've got a number of people asking questions on the mobile side, and, mobile can be a great component piece, and I think we could have an hour-long discussion about, what are the limitations and what's the best use of it, but also kind of building on what you said, even within the HP solution where they had a mobile component, we had to think about, this was an international, so they had the Symbian, the Nokia platform in Europe that was heavily proliferated, then they had the iPhone and the Apple, and then they had Droid, and then they had the BlackBerry, so they had multiple areas, so using something in Flash isn't going to work across all those if they have a large Apple population. So you have to be able to know that and then pick it out in such a way that you can use the tool appropriately. So you may be really good point.
And there are platforms and providers out there now that are beginning to create authoring tools that will address those things. But you've got to watch for them and know that it's a thing to be aware of.
Yep.
For sure. Yeah.
Aware of older devices as well.
Yeah, and you have to. I think as we've done a number of these, you have to learn what's currently out there, right? So you have to understand what your learners use today, because many times we've got clients who say, they're all using BlackBerry, and then they find out that 25% of them are using iPhones. So you don't know that. You've got to go kind of figure that out too, which is an important piece. Yep. So cost and development. So let's talk just briefly about that if we can.
So cost and development, when you take it into consideration for your build, really kind of goes back to that budget piece. How much do I have to work with? And sometimes, let's be candid, that budget is going to constrain us with what our delivery modes are. But there are the obvious savings, for example. If I can take an instructor-led component that maybe we're delivering product knowledge today, and I determine that I can, in fact, do that just as effectively virtually, there's some cost savings components that I can realize there. I guess the one thing that I would really point out is sometimes if you get into full-blown e-learning solutions, those can be time-consuming and expensive to deploy as compared to perhaps a short instructor-led intervention. But it's that balance that we've got to strike between both. And I hate to keep harping on it, but if you go back to what those objectives are and how you're going to assess them, then you can look at what your different delivery modes are and make that determination. How does that line up with my budget?
I think that's a great point. That's a key piece is, making sure that you're aligning them correctly. And then talk about that, though, from updating the content. How does that fit into there, Julie?
Well, there's typically just a couple ways that you can update your content that you would. You can either update it piece by piece, so component by component, or as a program as a whole. So one benefit of blended learning is you can remove the interdependency of the various pieces. So you could develop a mobile piece and maybe just update that, but not necessarily need to update the web-based training piece. So quick, easy updates if you can do it piece by piece. But if there's a paradigm shift in your training component, then you might need to update the program as a whole, which is fine and it's great. It does take a little bit more time and a little bit more budget, of course.
Yeah, I think also one of the things I know you talk about a lot, Julie, is making sure that when you put content together, you put it together, especially on the web-based side, using either templates or module pieces, so you can actually plug and play. So if you know you've got a technology that's spinning or increasing or something that's going to change very rapidly, make that so you can update it without rebuilding everything.
Absolutely.
It's a great one. Yep. And then, Charles, our favorite subject, how do you track?
Well, if you go back to that programmatic approach, one of the things that I'd stress is make sure you do think through how you're going to track their progress through the program. You'll likely find yourself, if you're deploying multiple delivery modes, asking questions around how do I trap and report up on program completion when I have maybe something reports from my LMS or something comes across from a mobile device. So that's some thought that you're going to want to put into the front end of your program around what do I need to be able to track, and perhaps that plays a role in the method in which I'm going to deliver the content. And then across the program as a whole, how do I measure the participants' progress through it, not only in just completing the event, but those behavior changes and those learning objectives that we were looking for. The one piece to watch for is we build those programs. If you've defined those business objectives up front and the behaviors you're looking to drive, then you can assess those behaviors as your leading indicators. Right? If they are changing their behavior and doing blank, faster, better, or different, then that should lead to these business results. So you get a little foresight, if you will, that we've driven the right behaviors, we're expecting these business results, and that sets the stage for your business tracking for your senior leadership down the line.
So Charles, here's the $1,000,000 question. Carrot or stick?
You know, I've always been a fan of the carrot until it proves it doesn't work. But if it's built right, and you address all the different learning aspects out there and the different learning styles people have, I found much more success with the carrot than the stick.
Sure. And well, I think the nice thing now is, to the point you made earlier, you have a lot more carrots now, right? Whether that's a game, whether that's an easy access point, whether that's a virtual versus face, you have a lot more ways to incent people to do things, as opposed to just the thou shalt. You must have to do it, and we're reporting to your boss.
Absolutely. We've got all kinds of different ways now to make it fun.
Right. So it's up, it puts a little more pressure on us because fun wasn't always in the curriculum earlier, but it gives us something to work on.
Yep.
Well, I'm going to summarize here, and then we've got some questions I want to answer. We've done a good job in answering some of them. I think we've talked a little bit about some of the current trends that's happening out there, the combinations, the programmatic approach, looking at it with, everything from, gaming. We didn't really touch on, but podcasts, taking information that's just information and getting it out there, through to web-based, virtual instructor-led, and then back-ending it with something else to follow it up and think of it and kind of putting a wrapper around the whole thing from consistency. And then the decision-making criteria. So we've hit a number of those, and we've got some questions that I'm going to try to put together here, Charles, for you and Julie. And one of them kind of goes back to what we just talked about on the carrot and stick side. What inspires employees to actually contribute to the peer-to-peer discussion boards? Charles, what have you got on your side that does that?
It was an interesting dynamic that I watched develop, and I go back to those YouTube-type platforms that are out there. It seems to be the public recognition. It seems to be the ability to go out there and establish myself as I have a best practice, or I have something that works very well, and to get that recognition from peers, that drives the willingness to put content out there in the open. And if you spend some time out on either one of those platforms, it continues to amaze me that people will take their best practices or their thoughts, things that they've invested blood, sweat, and tears in, and literally just volunteer it up for the satisfaction of getting the feedback from the others that, hey, that's great, that sounds good, that works for me. That seems to be sufficient motivation if you can give them the forum in which they can share.
Yeah, I think in the sales area, it's probably more intuitive that salespeople like the accolades because that tends to be a generalization you can make. But I'm always impressed, too, with engineering or operations, the number of people that actually contribute to peer-to-peer. So it's not just limited to salespeople or people looking, who like that kind of visibility. There's a lot of different motivators for it.
Think about why people use Facebook and all the social media. They want the recognition. They like to share their thoughts and feelings, and
right.
See who comments on their post.
Well, and I think the other side of it too is let's be real. Even though we're in the learning world, a lot of peer-to-peer people believe that the real knowledge is in the field or within the hands of the people who do it, not necessarily in the learning organization. So they want to check with others they know or they view as successful in that area.
Yep.
Lastly, and Charles and Julie, maybe I'll throw this one to you guys. Somebody asked, there were a couple of questions around mobile teasers. What's a mobile teaser? Can you give me an example of a mobile teaser?
Yeah. Well, go ahead, Julie.
Well, I can think of a couple ways you could do a mobile teaser. One, you could actually make little advertisement or video that you would, which is what we did for Hewlett-Packard, that you could send out over a mobile device. So you create a little movie, we created a Flash movie, converted it to MP4 format so it's visible on most devices, and just send that out. And it's very kind of markety and engaging. And you would do this in order to get some excitement around the program.
Right.
So it is an advertisement or a marketing piece. Another thing you can do is even just send out a simple SMS or text message. You know,
right.
Get ready to start your training program in 3 days. Oh, okay, I got to do my pre-work. Get ready to start your training program in 2 days. Oh my gosh, I got to go and fill out a form. So sending out mobile teasers is a good way. People always have their device with them, so it gets the message out quickly. People generally don't decline. They have to look at it at some point in time, even if it's to delete it.
Right. Well, and there's a bit of a marketeer that has to come out here as well, because I know we've effectively used mobile teasers with AT&T, where there was a training event coming up on a new product, and by teasing them with it saying, hey, there's a new product, new colors are coming, and a lower price point, come to the training, check it out, it's coming in 3 days. I mean, those are great ways to get attention to it without trying to cram a whole training course into a mobile device.
Right. Give them the high points and pique their interest.
And Charles, you had more to add?
I was going to say, you can ready an organization for the change through that very thing, and I think you guys articulated it very well. We'll use it as an upfront change management process that may ping a salesperson and say, man, has your customer ever said blank and you were stuck? And that's it. That's the whole message. And it gets the salesperson thinking, yeah, I have felt that. And maybe we follow it up a week later with a message that said, wouldn't it be great if you could do blank? And they go, well, golly, I wish I could. And then a week later you go, hey, it's here. Come see it. And at this point now they've had some time to think about it, and they're pulling the training or going to the event rather than being assigned.
I think that's a great example. I mean, that builds right on what I was trying to say, Charles, of, we have to become a bit of a marketeer in here, because you were just marketing what you were, what you're selling to your organization, which is the training course. So those are fantastic examples of grabbing the attention of the learner and getting them to come in, so you can kind of get past that, you have to come, and give it to the, here's an exciting reason to be there.
Yep.
Nicely done. Well, we've had a couple other questions. We're going to answer those individually. As I mentioned earlier, this will be available for those on, and we'll post it on our web. It'll be available later today if you want to share this with others. Really appreciate Charles and Julie. Julie has always done a phenomenal job, and I'm used to that. But Charles, my personal thank you for joining us. This has been fun putting it together, and your content is fantastic. So thank you very much.
I appreciate the time today. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. We look forward to it. We have more on our webinar series coming up. Look to us at vialearning.com for more information on our upcoming webinars, and we'll see you next time. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Julie.
Thank you.